Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in downtown Washington at the conclusion of a national security space panel discussion on the FY19 budget. I don't even know what budget year that we're in, and we're honored to have with us Drs. Bill LaPlante, who is the former United States Air Force Acquisition Chief, now Senior Vice President at the MITRE Corporation, which is a federally funded research and development center, and Jamie Morin, who was the former CAPE, obviously one of the easiest jobs in all of the Pentagon, now leading the Space Policy Center at the Aerospace Corporation, which is another FFRDC, and it's really great. It was great listening to you guys again up there. It was a little bit like old times. And Bill, I want to start with you. I mean, one of the discussion was the Trump administration's budget plan for 19 and how does it look? And you started it off, we're going to end on your positive note, Jamie, but you know, Bill, you started with a note of concern that you flashed to the audience. Talk to us a little bit, you know, you started it on a little bit of a downbeat note where you were talking about the magnitude of the challenges facing the United States space enterprise. Talk to us a little bit about the magnitude of the challenges that we have to wrap our arms around that go beyond just, you know, that there are more programs to fund, for example, than there's money to fund them.
Yeah, the couple things going on. First is that the threat, both Russia and China are not standing still in space. And we don't get a lot of it out in the American public other than maybe 60 Minutes, but it's a very alarming what they're doing and how quickly they're moving. So at the same time, we've got to modernize our architectures. We are still living off of our architectures from the Cold War for communications, for sensing, for missile defense. We don't really have right now a missile defense sensor network in space that we need. All of those need to be put in place immediately. We need to move out. And there's been a lot of studies done over the last several years. We're done with studies. We need to start executing and fielding those systems. On the positive side is I think the current leadership at the Pentagon, people like the new R&E, Mike Griffin, he gets all of this. And so I think we're going to see some really positive things, but there's a lot of work in front of us. No more studies. Maybe some studies, but we're going to start fielding things.
Well, Jamie, let me take you to that because, I mean, everybody has been pushing a much greater commercial approach. Everybody's talking about, hey, look, let's use commercial technology and get it up there. But you see that there are some quite significant challenges to that. Talk to us a little bit about what you see are the big challenges with that kind of a thoroughly blended, extremely rapid approach.
So I think it's important to note that commercial represents probably our single biggest opportunity in space. But if we're going to seize the opportunity, we've got to be really smart about how we build a single coherent enterprise that puts together a whole bunch of different individual commercial capabilities that are not designed to be integrated. So the challenge for the government is to figure out how to harness all of this extraordinary innovation that's occurring, you know, all over the United States in space companies, but not lose sight of the fact that in defense, oftentimes the single weakest link in your enterprise is the one that your adversary goes for. And so we can't let sort of a patchwork come together in an unorganized way. We've got to be strategic about harnessing this commercial innovation.
Bill, you were 3 years as Air Force Acquisition Chief and were working to open up space, for example, and get the commercial players that were in there. You were part of the team that was working that really, really hard. There's a sense now with some of the acquisition reform changes that have been driven by legislation that everybody is looking to be able to do things much faster, devolve greater authority further down. The last administration was a little bit criticized for trying to centralize too much. On the other hand, in defense of Frank Kendall, he would say, look, I'm the oversight authority, and we did drive the price of programs down because of that focus on cost, and you focused on that also, taking tens of billions of dollars out from program costs. But talk to us about the balance between speed and getting it right, because there is a lingering concern that taking off the sort of shackles and having everybody accelerate could have actually folks doing not as smart things faster, for example. Talk to us about getting that balance right.
So there is a saying that to go fast, you got to start slow. So I think the key part is at the very beginning to take whatever it is, 3-6 months, to make sure you understand the requirements, understand what the options are. Then you can move very fast. I mean, Secretary Gates spent a year with the Pentagon in 2010 looking at the future of long-range strike, out of which emerged the most incredible set of requirements that became now the B-21. That year was well spent. And so we really knew by the time we dropped that RFP and we got the contract, we were buying the right thing. So it does take a little bit of slowness at first to do it right and go fast. But I think the trend of pushing authorities, or you're alluding to, back to the services is a very good one. The last I heard is there's really only 8 or 10 programs that even are going to be acquisition authorities going to be in OSD. They're all being pushed back to the services. So this is an opportunity for the services really to move out and be agile. I just would caution that they spend the beginning of moving out doing the right thinking about the choices they're going to make, not just on the technology, but on the acquisition strategy.
You know, the special operators, Vago, say go slow to go smooth and go smooth to go fast. And there's a lot to be said for that. We can lose time figuring out what we're doing up front, but we lose a lot more time if we start a program and then realize it's not what we need. And the space is changing so quickly. You know, Bill used the term requirements. We may, in some cases, have to get away from the formality of the requirements process in order to harness some of these commercial developments. We've got to be capable of on-ramping that in smart ways. So that when the world changes around you, you're able to adjust on the fly and bring, you know, whether it's exciting technology or just new applications of the technology in an operational sense, bring those into the mix in a really responsive and resilient way.
One of the biggest differences between the commercial world today and how the Defense Department does business is the commercial world, whether it's in software or space, doesn't pretend to know the requirements they're going to have 5 years from now. They don't even pretend to. They just say, what can we develop in a minimal viable product and get it and see if it will work. So it's a different thought of the requirements. The other piece of it is you got to iterate with the person asking for it to monetize the requirements, to say, well, you want this extra capability, this is how much extra it's going to cost, and get that decision loop really tight. And so I think it's not just the acquisition, it's the requirements and it's the money. If you bring those three together in a very tight, agile process, you can do things smart and you can do things fast.
Let me ask you about an example of success, right? I mean, there's this sense that the system is too plodding and can't move with great agility. But you noted that when we had to shoot down a very large satellite of ours that was out of control, actually, that the system moved with remarkable speed, and you were part of that team looking at it. Talk to us a little bit about what some of those lessons were and what you were able to produce and do in a very, very few short set of months.
Yeah, in full disclosure, I'm not going to pretend that I was in the middle of it. I was more an observer. But the labs and the FFRDCs that Jamie and I work at now and other were pulled together with a Missile Defense Agency team. I want to say it was in about 2 months, saying we got this emergency. We've got this tumbling satellite. We got to take it out. What can we do now? And we're going to use an Aegis and with a standard missile. And the teams, what I remember, working weekends, nights, doing simultaneously modeling where to hit, what command and control to use. They pulled it off. They shot the thing down within probably about a 2-month planning period. So I think when you mobilize the national security apparatus around a real operational mission, they will perform. They will get it done. And so it was very encouraging to see that, and I think that it's a reminder that we can do this. But remember, they were given a real problem with a real time window, and there were potentially lives at stake, and they rose to the occasion.
And with minimal space debris, right? Unlike the Chinese approach, which left a lot of debris up there. Talk to us a little bit about changing requirements because of changing threats and how that's going to affect and how that should affect programs. One of the things that made you highly popular in the Pentagon was looking at some long-range trends about adversaries we're doing and then overlaying that on systems we were developing and being the guy in the room who said, you know, I know you really want this, but the world is changing. Let's talk about hypersonic weapons for a second and how that should change how we're planning for the future. And I want to get some of your engineering lessons learned on this because the United States was a hypersonic leader, something that we were focused on particularly for weapons, and then there were a couple of weapons tests that didn't go right, and all of a sudden we were out of that game, but the Chinese are putting huge investment in that to the point where the former Deputy Defense Secretary, or when he was Deputy Defense Secretary, Bob Work, was ringing the alarm bell on that very issue. Talk to us a little bit about how the department needs to think through, A, how serious the hypersonic threat is, second, how the department needs to wrap its mind around getting out of massive, even if it's very, very large programs of record, because the threat has fundamentally changed, as opposed to doing what we do just because we're doing it.
So speed is one path to survivability of a weapon and one path to responsiveness in a weapon. Right? You can trade speed for stealth, for survivability. You can trade speed, for loitering, for responsiveness. So hypersonics is a technology area. It's not in and of itself a problem or a solution. It's one of the pieces to the puzzle. The story you've laid out on the backing away in hypersonics research is not incorrect. But fundamentally, the Chinese and the Russians, I think, have invested heavily in short and medium range missiles because it aligns with their strategy. The U.S., a short or medium range missile fired from the continental U.S. doesn't really hit anything of interest. So we didn't invest in that for treaty reasons in Europe and for geography reasons. We instead have a concept that is about fighting an away game, right? And so we made different investments. That's the root of where we're at now. But the fact that other nations have made these investments and are, looks like are starting to turn to operational capability there, that creates something that we've got to be ahead of, whether it's in terms of defense or in terms of creating a new deterrent relationship. And there's a whole bunch of investments there, most of which I suspect the department's not going to be real comfortable talking about.
Bill?
Yeah, I just would add, it's important to distinguish two categories of hypersonics. There is the powered flight hypersonics, which involves a very difficult engine technology. There's been a lot of research on that over the years. I think the Air Force about 3 years ago probably had the longest successful flight of a hypersonic engine. It was about a minute. Okay, so that has been around for a long time. There's a lot of expertise on that. We haven't really operationalized that. What is quote unquote new, although it's really not new, is the following. Taking a ballistic missile, let's say a 3-stage ballistic missile, and putting on as a payload, instead of having a warhead or something else, putting a glide vehicle on it that basically you take the booster, you go up maybe to 300,000 feet, you come down about to 100,000, and you let go of the glide vehicle with no power. It can basically glide 6, 7, 10,000 miles around the Earth, both downrange and cross range. That's what the potential of this technology is. What are the challenges with it? The challenges are integrating it onto the booster, that's one. The second is thermal management. The thermal situation when you're doing the kind of Gs that glider does is a difficult thing to do, and it also has aerodynamic challenges. We tried it twice. DARPA did 2 experiments called the Falcon series. Both of them were noble experiments. Both of them failed for a combination of aerodynamics and thermal issues, and we stopped as a country. China and Russia have continued, and they are ahead of us in this regard. And the reason this type of hypersonics is probably so interesting is the fact that if you can make this reliable, you can deliver a payload, whatever you want it to be, pretty much halfway around the world, and not just on a ballistic trajectory, but left, right as well. And so it's quite concerning from a defensive perspective. We're going to have to defend against it as a country, and this is an area we need to understand what you could do offensively and defensively. That's the new piece of hypersonics that I think is really people are waking up to.
Do you see a change? I mean, you mentioned this. You said the North Koreans are getting good at their missiles are improving because they keep learning from their failures and developing better systems. Do you guys see a change in the atmosphere of being able to take risk but also failing? At the end of the day, everybody admires Senator McCain and his drive for acquisition reform and all the congressional leadership. On the other hand, that very leadership is the first one to, what did you say, Bill, up there, that you thought that acquisition officials would have been arrested at the end of the Air Force acquisition officials, if something like that had failed? Do you guys notice a change in the willingness to take risk and to fail?
I think it's just too soon to say, right? We have to see the first big high-profile failure, and we haven't really seen that yet. And
there you go, being an empiricist again.
I'm very sorry.
Well, and the other thing, maybe I'm an optimist. I also believe we need to do a better job educating the American public on what hardcore development is. Not production, not sustainment, but development. The whole idea, if you're an engineer and doing development, is you want to understand as quickly as possible what's not right with your design. You want to expose the risks. In other words, you want to identify the failures early. That's smart. That's how you learn. But most Americans don't see it. The iPhone just shows up in the store, right? And they don't see the failures that happen during the development. And so we have to educate people that when you're doing R&D, you're cutting edge development, this is how you learn. But people seem to understand it with SpaceX. That's 5 times to land on the barge. But they're learning each time. You have to remind ourselves that's how you advance. That's how you do development.
Well, a really important thing there is that SpaceX found a way to exercise that land on a barge without putting their core mission at risk.
That's right. That's right.
Those boosters that crashed on landing had already delivered satellites into orbit.
Right.
So that's clever.
That's right.
That's clever design, clever experiment design. They figured out a way to make money, to carry out a mission and satisfy a customer most of the time, while simultaneously testing their next technology. You can't always do that, but we can think clever
And it's not
about
just
that.
randomly trying things for failure. You have to allow enough time after the try to learn what happened and fix what you're doing. So you can do it, if you do it too fast, you're actually not learning. So you have to do it fast enough that you can make progress, but not too fast. It's very tricky to do it well. We as a country know how to do this. We did it with Apollo. We've done it in the military. We did it with the first ICBMs. We did it with the first Polaris submarine. We know how to do this. But it is reminding people this is a development process. Development which most of the American public do not see. We see products show up at the parking lot. We see them show up online. We don't see the development of it, but the development involves this kind of learning. It's called developmental testing, developmental learning.
There's actually a great analogy here. You remember that period where, I'll leave the brand name out, but there was a certain cell phone that you couldn't carry on any airplane? That's the environment that defense most often operates in, because there are people, mostly service members, but the American people as a whole, who are relying on the capabilities the department provides. And especially that's true in space, right? Space makes the whole joint force work. And so unlike the 1950s, 1960s, where everything we did in space was new and there were people that desperately wanted the capability, but there was nobody that had it today, continuity of mission is a much bigger constituency today.
Yes.
And so we've got to be able to rapidly change without accepting undue risk for all the people who are who are presuming that the capability is going to be there, not just in the the nation's worst day when a war is going, but every day. And so that's a serious management
Remember
challenge.
the former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Mark Welsh, used to say, people assume this stuff is there like turning on the lights. And we all take it for granted. And so that's the key thing, is this has become so ubiquitous in our life that that's what's different than the 50s and 60s.
Well, so let's talk briefly, and I know you guys both have to go, but let me ask you this two last questions. First is overclassification. Everybody is talking around failures and gaps in U.S. military capability. Is it time, and everybody points to that interview, when you said 60 Minutes, that was General Hyten went on TV to tell the American public the vulnerabilities in space and the likelihood of warfare in space that people haven't been thinking about.
And he also said, I'm not NASA.
And he also famously said, I'm not NASA. But does the department, does the nation, do its leaders have to be a lot more honest with the American people to frame what the shortcomings are? Because absent that, you're not going to get the level of investment that you need on a sustained basis.
Yes, and the challenge is, how do you do it without spooking the herd, as they say? You don't want to be just saying the threat is 10 feet tall. You want to be circumspect about it, but we also have to be honest. I would draw the analogy maybe where we were 10 years ago with cyber. And those of us that were working in cyber and classified arenas would tell our friends and family, it's a much bigger problem than you think, I just can't talk about it. You don't have to do that anymore. Everybody understands cyber is a real problem because of what we see every day in our lives. That's sort of the analogy of where we are today in space. All people can do is wink, wink, nod, nod, and say, oh, it's a bigger problem than you think. So we have to get a way to educate the American public without alarming them. There's nothing really to be alarmed about. It just means we got to get organized.
Well, I mean, look, right, your Uber doesn't, nothing arrives, right? Everything basically fails once that space architecture, God forbid, is taken out. So it's not just a theoretical concern for military troops that are on the front edge, but it's true for everybody, whether they're on an airliner or, again, waiting for their Uber. Let me ask you, you're going to be optimistic about this, so I'm going to end with you on an optimistic note. But why the optimism? Because if you look at it, there is concern. Just a couple of weeks ago, we talked to the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee here, Adam Smith, and he's like, look, I don't want to be a pessimist. I'm just being a realist. There's 2 years worth of money. And is the department going to spend that 2 years worth of money in a way that's going to be value added, given that after that it's likely to decline? His concern is certainly the debt. There are other members who have that same concern. Talk to us. Is this plan a good plan that gets us to where we need to be if in 2 years' time we're going to see a downturn? And why are you optimistic still?
So the point that we have 2 years of money, and oh, by the way, that's FY 2018, which is already halfway over, and FY 2019 is a really important one. So we really have 18 months of funding where the Congress has agreed to what the top line should be. It's in the Congress's hands right now to decide what the details are of the 2018 allocation of the additional resources that came available to the department. And they've got, I think, a pretty good handle on it, but they're balancing a lot of priorities there. I wouldn't, it is not reasonable to expect the Congress to produce a sort of soup to nuts strategy and optimized set of capabilities. Right? They're not staffed for that. They don't have the analytics for that. So I hope, and I've seen some indications that they're collaborating closely with the department to make sure those additional resources are maximized. 2019, the president sent over his budget. Again, the dollars that were added at the end with the budget agreement were pretty large. And my sense is that the allocation of them was largely decentralized to the services. My guess is the Congress will find, when they get into the details, some strong points and some weak points, and they'll move a fair bit of this money around. The department had really only a short amount of time to allocate the additional dollars.
One thing I would add to that is the new Undersecretary for R&E, Mike Griffin, is passionate about the issues that we talked about today, the space issues, and he gets it. He gets it. So another reason to be optimistic is we have now in place with Mike and his job somebody who is prone to action and understands the space issue. And so that also gives me confidence, having worked with Mike over the years.
But are they the right priorities? Are the monies going to go to the right places? I mean, yes, he does come with a deep space background, came from NASA, knows R&D, knows technology really well. But is where the money is going to go in the space arena going to be value added when we look back on this period, say in 5 years, when we might have a little bit less money going to defense than we'd like?
I don't think you're going to have a better chance than right now with somebody like Mike there. Mike, by the way, also understands missile defense. He understands national security space. He was central to some of the work to get off the RD-180 Russian engine that we did when I was in the Air Force. He knows what needs to be done, and him and the team there with Ellen Lord and others in the services, it's what Jamie said. We'll see, but the proof will be in the pudding. If they move the money and put the money against these problems we're talking about, the hypersonics problem, the missile defense problem, the new space architectures for resiliency, if they can move and actually put money and do development on that, not do studies, then I'm going to be really optimistic. But I think you have this is the chance right now. They have it, and it's often said that getting a program started, what we used to call milestone B, is the actual most critical time in a program. And so you have a chance to have a couple of milestone Bs in the next few years to get programs started and started right. You're not going to be done in 2 years, but if they get them started, I'm optimistic.
So right now the department's budget projects significant growth, and it's been approved by the Congress from 2017 to 2018, and substantial growth from 2018 to 2019. And then it's flat in inflation-adjusted terms every year from there on. That may or may not be where we end up, but there's actually as much of a risk to the downside as there is to the upside. We're looking at nearly $1 trillion deficits in each year of those out years, and that's a large number that'll probably have some political reaction. It remains to see how that plays out, but that is a risk the department's got to be very much aware of, because starting programs that you don't finish is really a good way to waste taxpayer money.
And so that was spoken like a true former comptroller.
Well, there's a famous study done by our sister FFRDC, IDA, that did a correlation between when a program was started, milestone B, was it a favorable budgeted climate or a very tough one? And in tough budgeted climates, the actual program did worse. So the hypothesis behind it is when you're really tight with money, you do a lot of things that are not that smart because you convince yourself you have to do them anyway. So you have an opportunity to start programs the right way with this bit of money. That's what I would just say.
And then you get the last word. Why are you so optimistic? You ended this with a nice little jab about the Chinese program and budgeting system. So tell us why you're still so optimistic.
So look, for me, the biggest sort of optimism is recognizing that if, as a nation, we're serious about planning for potential great power conflict, those are societal conflicts. And in the space sector, a huge share of global innovation is happening in the United States. We have people moving to the United States, engineers, entrepreneurs, coming here to start space companies, to start tech companies. And it is that excitement, that energy, is a U.S. national asset, right? We don't have a control economy. By the way, increasingly neither do the Chinese, but in the national security sector, they still have much more control. But our assets in the United States for these things include that whole arsenal of democracy, which are these extraordinarily entrepreneurial companies that are all over our space sector right now. Those are, if the government can figure out how to take advantage of that energy and that enthusiasm, the capital that's come into those markets, we're going to be in a very strong long-term competitive position. But we've got to get through that.
And I sense you have something you wanted to say.
Well, I would rather be in our place than the Chinese place. I wouldn't trade with them for all the reasons Jamie just said.
But as a comptroller, wouldn't you like their PPBR system, which seems to have a little bit more funding stability?
I have a commitment to democracy. I kind of like it.
Dr. Morin, always a pleasure. Dr. LaPlante, sir, thanks very much. Really appreciate it.